Saturday, October the 23rd, 1982, Noach. Page 29 in the Chumash, the 8th chapter of the book of Genesis. Does anybody not have a Chumash? There is a well-known story of one of the great Hasidic masters who was leading the congregation in prayer on the Day of Atonement. And he got to the verse after the Yishtabach prayer, which occurs about in the middle of the Shacharit, or the morning service. Yishtabach, Kaddish, and Baruch Hu, and the congregation responded. And then there is a line which is only included on the High Holy Days. It's a very short line. Or olam be'otzar chayim, orot me'ofel, amar vayehi. It's a difficult line. It's not quite sure what it means. Each individual word is clear, but the whole piece together is not too clear. Or olam means light of the universe. It's some reference to God as the light of the world, or olam. Be'otzar chayim, in the treasury of life, storehouse of life. Orot me'ofel. Orot means lights in the plural, and ofel means darkness. So lights from darkness. Amar, he spoke, presumably referring to the opening verses of the book of Genesis. Vayehi, and everything came into being. This particular Hasidic master, or Rabbi, got to the middle of this verse, or olam be'otzar chayim. He was facing the ark. As we used to say, he was davening in front of the Omud, or he was acting as pre-center in more sophisticated English. And he stopped in the middle of the line, and he stood there transfixed for the rest of the day. That is to say, the phrase light of the universe, the idea that God is referred to as the light of the universe, suddenly struck him as such an incredibly profound thought that he couldn't budge beyond that point. The idea is to give some indication of the mystical depths of this gentleman. The story does not record what the congregation did, whether the fast of Yom Kippur ended 6 days later when the gentleman finally came to ground again. Well, I have no aspirations to be a Hasidic master. However, when I opened my Bible during the week to check over what we were going to be reading in the synagogue this morning, I had a comparable experience with the verse that I asked you to look at this morning, which we want to discuss here today, the first verse of the 8th chapter of the story of Noah. Vayiskor Elohim et Noach. It's on page 29. Vayiskor Elohim et Noach, and God remembered Noah. V'et kol hachaya, and every living thing. V'et kol habehema, and all the cattle. Asher ito b'teiva, that were with him in the ark. Vayaver Elohim ruach al haaretz. God made a wind to pass over the earth. Vayashoku hamayim, and the waters assuaged. That was my light of the universe. I thought I'd like to ask anybody else whether they're having a similar experience with this verse. For those of you who are new to the SAJ, we take our study session on Shabbat very seriously, and we welcome serious responses from visitors as well as congregants. What is it that makes a modern, I mean, you must prove to me that I'm not crazy, that I wasn't the only one who stopped at this verse. What is it about this verse that gives us a problem today? A problem of such an order that if we are reading the Bible with any kind of comprehension, we stop and we ask ourselves some serious questions. Anybody? We'll be here for 6 days unless I get some response. Aaron?
God remembered Noah. It seems like just for chance remembered him, as if forgot all about him, and then suddenly, my God, Noah is out there, you know.
I like that one. That wasn't the one that I was thinking of, but I like it very much. That's a very human interpretation. In other words, God, having brought about this enormous cataclysm, destroyed the entire world except this ark, falls asleep somewhere. He's having a little schluff. And suddenly he wakes up and he says, let me see. Oh, no. The hope of humanity is bobbing around like a cork on the ocean. And he forgot. Like you forget to make a telephone call, or you forgot to pay your tax bill or something. It's a wonderful insight, Aaron. And of course, it presents us with a problem. You are taking it literally. The idea that God has a mind, that he should remember, that memory applies to God at all. But that's exactly, one reaction could easily be, what is going on here? God is on some kind of moral purpose here, destroys the entire world, Noah builds the ark, everybody's in there, they're all waiting for God, and I'm trying to think of something comparable in the kind of fear that you've been forgotten. What's coming to my mind, actually, is Arthur Clarke's novel, 2001. The kind of terror you feel when you realize everything is going wrong in that spaceship. The computers are starting to answer back, and everything is going to pieces. By the way, I understand, where is George Davison? There's a 2003 coming out this week. Is it 2003 or 2009? What? Is 2009 or 2010? I'm sorry, I knew it was something, but I've forgotten. 2010. And the sense that, why doesn't somebody on earth do something about this? Why doesn't somebody care? Is there nobody back home? Has everybody forgotten? Anybody think of another example where you're out there on a limb and you assume your support systems are with you, but they're all busy with other things? Arthur Koestler had a recurring nightmare of the 20th century. He should have known. He was in half a dozen concentration camps in Spain and in France. He said it's a nightmare of being, well, I'll use a modern example, of being pulled off Central Park. Thousands of people are walking up and down on a Saturday afternoon, and a group of muggers just pull him off Central Park and beat him up, and he's screaming for help in the bushes, and nobody gives a blind bit of notice. Vayizkor Elohim et Noach, God remembered Noah. That wasn't my response, but it's an interesting one, an insightful one. Yes? Excuse me, just a moment. We didn't say anything yet. We haven't started. Who's turning the lights off? Would somebody please check about the lights? It's depressing here. Tell them it's anti-Semitic to do this in the middle of the sermon. Even if they don't agree with me, they can just go and leave, but they don't have to turn the lights off. It's like in 1948, before the foundation of the State of Israel, everybody was leaving the state. There was a notice at Ben Gurion Airport, or whatever Ben Gurion Airport was called then. Will the last person please turn the lights off? All I said was light from darkness. Don't tell me we have a fuse. All right, let's see. I'm sorry, what was the point that you were making? Oh, that is a very lovely point. It's a continuation from Aaron's point, a point that applies this homiletically to the modern world. The idea that, thank you so much. Thank you very much. The idea that there is a relationship between the foundation of the State of Israel and the Holocaust, which is almost like a mythical notion that at a time when the fortunes of the Jewish people reached an all-time low, then suddenly God remembered them. That's a good point, excellent point. But that's not the one that, Robert? Which one, what are you referring to right now? Yes, that is the point that was being made, that there is a relationship between the two, but what we have to be aware of is the fact that in the classical myth, desolation, persecution, oppression always precedes redemption, and one is never too sure whether the redemption is related to the desolation or the two are separate. But that is the point that's being made. Lillian? I think that's a very important point. That's not the point that I have in mind. As a matter of fact, all of these things are new to me, and I think they're wonderful. But of course, the story of Noah is very relevant in terms of the notion of a nuclear holocaust, because the whole idea of the entire world being destroyed in itself is a measure of how even before men had split the atom, they had this apocalyptic notion. They couldn't do it then, but that God would do it. Now we can do it ourselves, unfortunately, and this idea is in the text. And if I can take your point further, Lydian, maybe you would want to read this verse, is that hopefully that God will remember us, or the godly spirit in us will remember before it gets too late, and will try to do something about it so that we won't destroy the world again this time round. Would you accept that as a homiletical continuation of your idea? But certainly there is this notion of nuclear holocaust here. But that's not what I'm looking for. Yes? Yes, there are notes at the bottom of the page. And God did make a promise that he would preserve him. But nevertheless, I think Aaron's point comes up even more strongly now. If he promised him, what was he doing sleeping? I mean, why did he nod? Why did he forget? Yes? Well, we have to limit ourselves to the framework of the story. Let me explain, in case we have any fundamentalists in the congregation this morning, or any fundamentalists remaining in the congregation this morning, that we take the Bible not literally but seriously. We take this as a myth. This is the story. We write stories for the same reason that we create fantasies, because we can't stand reality. A story or a fantasy is a way of avoiding reality. What I'm asking is, what is the reality that this story is avoiding? That's what's got me stopped on this. This was my light of the universe verse. I stopped here. I couldn't carry on. This was the shocking verse. Does anybody else look at the verse? Try not to look at the verse in terms of what we already talked about. Just read this verse, quiet it yourselves, and what is your reaction? Let me read it again once more. And God remembered Noah. I presume you all know where we are in the story. That God, well, let's go back to the beginning of the story, just in case anybody hasn't read the Gideon Bible recently. We are here in a situation where God has created the world, created a garden with a man and a woman, Adam and Eve have sinned. He put a cookie jar in the middle of a nursery and said to the children, don't eat the cookies. And they were caught with their hands in, and he threw them out. He expelled them from the Garden of Eden. And now God has created another world, thousands of people all over the place, no nations or peoples as yet, and he has rejected them because they are full of Hamas. That is the word which our book of Genesis used. They are full of Hamas, and based on a verse that occurs in the book of Jonah, the word Hamas is translated as robbery. Everybody was thieving. They were all expensing. They were all fiddling their tax returns. Nobody was being honest with anybody. It was all gezel. There was all theft. And also they were homosexuals. I don't know why the rabbis were so heavy on this topic, but they believed that even the trees were perpetrating homosexuality. The cabbages were indulging in perverse sexual practices. Rashi says so. You know, I take this as some fantasy, and one has to understand the reality behind this one. That ki hishchit kol haaretz, the whole earth, not just human beings, but even the inanimate, the animals and everybody, they were all being promiscuous, trans-specifically. That was the crucial point. People weren't staying where they were put. It's curious, in view of the Supreme Court decision in connection with the Bob Jones University. By the way, when is that? Has it already been made, or is it coming? It hasn't. When is it coming? Well, those of you who know about that, the Bob Jones people love this chapter. The idea that everything belongs in its place and no groups should mix. There should be no mixing. Everybody should belong. If you were born black, you stay black. If you're born Jewish, you stay Jewish. You're born white, you stay white. And if you're born a donkey, you better stay a donkey. Don't get messing around with the chickens. Apparently the donkeys were making out with the chickens, according to Rashi, which is a curious notion, but that's what they said. So God said, that's finished. I can't stand a world in which donkeys make out with chickens. Off with their heads. We'll destroy them all. And if you read the story, they were all wiped out except one family, Noah. Noah and two of all animals in order to replenish the earth. And they're in this ark. And all of a sudden, God remembers Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. Remember that there's nothing left. There's nothing left anywhere except this ark, according to the story. And one man and his family and enough animals to start the world all over again, two of each kind. And God made a wind pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. What is your reaction to that verse? Richard?
God is some kind of a collective conscience of man. And the collective conscience is on a very low level. Then
Yeah, well, Richard, you've raised a very, very important point, which we will be coming to later on, that it would be wiser if we did not take the story of Noah and the flood to be a story about what God did to the human race, but rather that we take the story of Noah and the flood as a description of how the people who wrote this story conceived of God, and that it tells us more about their ethical views, as Richard points out, their collective consciousness, what they felt about themselves and about the world, than it tells us about any putative being, God, whether such a being exists or doesn't exist. The lady in the back? Could you stand, because I think we can hear better. What a nice, sweet interpretation. Thank you. You're sticking up for God. God bless you. Yes. You see, you have a few friends, even at the SAJ. Yes, Barbara. Thank you very much. That was the next question I was going to ask. I was going to ask the congregation, where have you met this verse recently? Let me ask that specifically right now. Where does this verse occur in the liturgy recently? Well, Barbara answered, but where particularly in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy? Where particularly, yes? In the middle section of the Musaf on Rosh Hashanah. In fact, this verse is the first. On Rosh Hashanah, we had the main part of the service consists of 3 sets of 10 verses each. Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. The first 10 proclaim God is king. The second 10 proclaim that God remembers. The third 10 relate to the blowing of the shofar. The first verse of the second group, the Zichronot, the memorial sections, is this verse from the 8th chapter, the first verse in the 8th chapter of Noah. However, Barbara, do you want to continue the point? That was just it. Well, I'm not getting a response on this first verse. What is yes, Mrs. Roberts. Yes, Phyllis.
It occurred to me that as you rework this story, that there's a kind of recreation of the Garden of Eden, or at least a second chance, in that Noah is the pious, righteous man who is survived. And if all living things survive in the ark, that's a kind of recreation and a second chance.
Yeah. Excellent point, Phyllis. Yes, this is a repetition of the original paradigm. We'll find that this is a repetition of another crucial paradigm. I don't know whether the other one will be immediately apparent to you. This is a repetition of the notion of condition of grace, sin, fall, exile, redemption, second chance. No question about it. Initial condition, humanity sins, fall, expulsion. I mean expulsion metaphorically. I mean, if you wipe everything out, that's one hell of an expulsion. But it is still expulsion. And then second chance in the ark. There's one other story that it picks up on. I don't know whether any of you will realize what that story is right now, but if you do, it'll be incredible. Yes, you know what the other story that's picked up on here? No, it's a story that's come up already. What was the story of Moses that you were thinking of? Yes, but it's not quite a second chance. It's not, in a sense, I suppose, the exodus from Egypt is a second chance, because the persecution of the Jews may be seen to have been as a result of their sins. But there is another story that occurs before. Yes, Florence? How did you get to that one? I really wouldn't have thought that you would have got that. I'm reassured. It's the Cain and Abel story. Now we have to put that on the back burner for a moment. Excellent. It's a Cain and Abel story. It's another version of the Cain and Abel story. Because, well, Florence has jumped ahead of me. Nobody has yet really got to what I regard as, if I may say so, in all modesty, far more shocking than any of the interpretation or responses that you've had to this verse. Look at this verse. Doesn't it make you feel uncomfortable at all, on any level? Yes. no question about it, yes. What you're all picking up on is this curious attribute of the Bible which still bothers modern interpreters because we don't really understand the full implications of this, that the Bible seems to be saying the same thing over and over and over again in different ways. Over and over again, the same thing is being said in different ways. There is that notion, overtone, that nuance, that reverberation, that God breathes life into moribund humanity and gives it a second chance. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Sarah Lee. That's what stuck me completely. I was horrified with this verse. Horrified with this verse. And I'm puzzled that nobody else was horrified. Horrified. One more chance. Was anybody else who didn't talk horrified with this verse? It's outrageous, this verse. I find it absolutely ethically offensive. What's wrong with it? Barbara?
That he remembered Noah, but everybody else wasn't fit for his remembrance.
The whole rest of the world, including all the animals and the beasts, were wiped out, and he decides to choose one family, and he remembers that family, and everybody else has been totally wiped out. Not a single thought for anybody else. Our whole world has been destroyed, and all God can remember is Noah. Oh, I'm not convincing you, I can see. You agree that they all should have been wiped out, I can see. Yes. I'm sorry, could you stand? I can't hear. No, he's just referring to those in the ark. Everything else is a total wasteland. The world is a total wasteland except for the ark. There's nothing alive anywhere. I find this verse offensive. Am I the only person in the synagogue who finds this verse offensive? Yes. You accept that? I'm asking you. Yeah. The whole world was corrupt except Noah and his family? That's right. Another example. Let me ask you a question, sir. I have a question. I have a question, sir. Do you remember the story? You're talking about the 18th chapter of the book of Genesis, the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, when there was a dialogue between Abraham and God said to Abraham, I'm going to destroy those two cities and wipe them out. Do you know what Abraham said in response to that? Julie? Well, he didn't start with 10. What did he start with? 50. And then he went on to, and then, yes, and then, yes, and then. Thank God you learned something from Hebrew school after all said and done. You can keep your bar mitzvah presents. It's okay. Now, a question that arises out of this. Why didn't Noah say, look, when God said to Abraham, I'm going to destroy two cities, Abraham gave him a hard time. He didn't win because, of course, the cities had already been destroyed. And the story was written ex post facto. You can't understand the Bible unless you realize that all these are attempts to understand things that have already happened. It's called, I think the Catholics call it Vaticinium ex eventu. The prophecy, or what is described as coming from in front, as if it's going to happen, coming from the front, is already happened already, and you put the prophecy in so it looks as if what has happened, in fact, happened because of what was said before. It's supposed to strengthen the faith. Now, yes, is it on this point? Is it on this point? Go ahead. I'll let you know. Go on.
No, it appears to me from what you say, and I accept it, that you're horrified. That
You don't believe me, do you?
this carried, no, and I agree with you, that this carried out is simply one more preparation for an acceptance of a Holocaust. It is to prepare the people to accept the most recent Holocaust that happened.
Oh, that's an incredible idea. That's an incredible idea. What you're saying is that the people who wrote the Bible knew that the Jewish people were the kind of a people that if they lived according to their traditions, the nations of the world would hate them and ultimately they would try to wipe them out. And therefore, like an inoculation gives you a small amount of the disease before you get the big load, you have to be constantly reminded, Jews, over thousands of years, that if you don't watch out, it's going to come, and sooner or later it will come. It's a very interesting idea, but it doesn't answer my question. Let me ask the question again. Why didn't Noah say to this God, God says to Noah, I'm going to destroy the whole world, not just two cities. The whole world. Why? And Noah said, yes, sir, yes, sir. I want to build an ark. Noah could have said, what could Noah have said? What could Noah have said to God? Let's go through this again. Let's try it again. What could Noah have said to God? But just a moment, one at a time. Hands up. Who has something to say? Yes.
Could have said the same thing that Abraham said. Are there any other good people in this whole world? If there are, do not destroy.
Right. Of course he could have said that. As a matter of fact, the absence of this discussion between Abraham and God is, of course, not something that our Jewish commentators would refer to, because, unlike me, they are much too respectful of the literary text. And therefore, since they believed it to be the Word of God, they would never raise any question about its ethical validity, which, of course, made them have to undergo incredible intellectual gyrations and gymnastics. So Rashi very interestingly says that God destroyed the world apart from Noah, but that world contained good people and wicked people. There is no foundation in the biblical text at all for this notion. There is no foundation in the biblical text at all for this notion. And yet the medieval commentators insist that there were some righteous people, in which case the question arises, why were they destroyed? And the answer is that if you happen to be unfortunate and live in the world at a time when most of the population are full of Hamas, then even though you are wicked, you get swept away with them. One might, the good. In other words, if you are good, you get swept away with the wicked. Now that is an incredible concession by Rashi. I think it was Rashi who says that. I can't put my finger on this right now. One of the medieval commentators. It's an incredible concession to the ethical poverty of the original text. That is to say, it's a midrash. It's an attempt to say there were some good people in Sodom and Gomorrah. There were some good people around, but God was so fair. Like Nazi Germany, do you think when Dresden was bombed, there weren't some righteous people there? Do you think when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, there weren't some righteous people? Do you think all the Japanese deserved to be bombed? Do you think all the Germans deserved to be bombed? I'm very reluctant to ask this question to any group of people today, especially Jews. Do you think all Arabs should be destroyed? Let's be very, very careful about this. When our ancestors crossed the Red Sea, the biblical version has it that Miriam picked up a musical instrument as she saw the Egyptians drowning and began to play music, and she and all the women danced and sang songs. The rabbis couldn't do anything with that text. They couldn't do anything with the text which said that as the Egyptians, the inveterate enemies of the Jews, were drowning in the Red Sea, Miriam and her cohort sang songs. They couldn't do anything with that text. But they could write another story, and they did. And some rabbi had a fantasy that not only was Miriam dancing and singing, but the ministering angels were dancing and singing as the Egyptians were gasping out their last breath in the water. Whereupon God rebuked the ministering angels. He said to them, "Shut up. Don't sing. The Egyptians are my creation. How dare you sing while my children are drowning?" Would anybody like to apply that to the recent bombing of West Beirut? Or to the Germans? It's hard, isn't it? What happened was that between the time that the biblical text was written and the time the rabbis began to feel ethically uncomfortable with the text, although they couldn't say it as clearly as I'm saying it today. We don't have to pussyfoot around, at least at the SAJ. The text is offensive. Why is the text offensive? Why is it offensive to say that God remembered Noah? Because in order to have this point made, an entire world had to be destroyed. What kind of a God is it that needs the destruction of the entire world in order to save one family, in order to accomplish what he wishes to accomplish? Lady in the back. I know what it made you think of. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Would you like to come up here and finish the sermon off? That's just beautiful. We all thank you very much indeed. I would never have thought of it, but as soon as you said it, I realized. In the book of Jonah, the cattle are constantly referred to, and as everybody who worshiped with us this year knows, at the very end of the book, when God says to Jonah, if I remember correctly, shall not I, he says to Jonah, you have had compassion upon the good, which rose up in a night and perished in a night. Shall I not have compassion on Nineveh, that great populous city, in which there are all these people who know not between their left hand and their right hand, and also much cattle. You're absolutely right. What we've discovered this morning, and we're very indebted to you, is, but we've already discovered it in another sense, is that the Bible is saying the same thing over and over and over again. It's almost like that the message, the central message in the Bible is repeated all the time in 1,000 different ways. And the notion of the evolution of God's personality, from being the kind of person he was in the book of Genesis to the kind of person he was in the book of Jonah, is of course an idea that a lot of people traditionally found impossible, because you cannot have evolution in the Bible. Everything in the Bible is the Word of God, and therefore it's all literally true. But we tend to think that the Bible in fact does evolve. And even the question we've just been discussing, the difference between Noah and Abraham, is a point that's well made by Erich Fromm in one of his little books on the Bible, where he draws attention to the moral advance, the moral progress between the time of Noah and Abraham. That in the case of Noah, Noah asked no questions. But already by the time of Abraham, men are not standing by and seeing God act like a hooligan without at least trying to control him in some way. What is the problem here? We can't see this as a problem. Yes, the lady in the back. That's a very good point. I have to disagree with you. The concept of a world flood is universal in world myth. It is so universal that there are tribes that live far away from any stretch of water, in deserts, for example, where there is no evidence of any water ever having been, and they also have flood myths. And some people think that it may have more to do with the fact that human beings are born in water, that the womb, from an evolutionary standpoint, is a miniature inland ocean. Salt water, the amniotic fluid. In other words, we all are given a second chance to live. The first chance is when our mothers are pregnant. The second chance is when we come out and we cease being fish and we get a second chance to live and breathe. This is one possibility, because there are people that have myths of floods even though they don't have any water or any oceans, or there's no evidence of having floods. And even this flood doesn't seem to have been a flood that covered the entire world. We're not sure. The other point that you made was that the Bible is an attempt to make people feel more comfortable, and you made a very important point there. You said that if some catastrophe, if I understood you correctly, if some catastrophe happens, if something awful happens, if an aeroplane crashes, if there's a car crash, if there's a flood or a plague or there's a Holocaust or something happens, it's much easier if we can account for what's happened in terms of good and evil. Is that what you were saying? You think that only happens at that time? But what about today? Supposing you're going to fly somewhere and you miss the airplane crashes, and everybody on board is killed. I don't want to be personal. Let's not ask you personally. I'm asking this rhetorically. Don't people who escape that kind of calamity feel that somehow they're special, they're chosen, they are exceptional, that other people get swept away but they don't? Don't all of us somewhere deep down have this notion that we're chosen individuals, never mind chosen people, that we're chosen individuals, that somehow we are the exception, and that other people fall by the wayside, but we will get through? Somebody who hadn't spoken before had their hand up. Yes, sir.
I get the feeling that this is very much about the injustice of a less than perfect God.
No, 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 no. Not about the injustice of an imperfect God. It's about the injustice of an imperfect world. The world isn't fair. The world is random. And all the time, random things are happening which people can't comprehend, not just then, even now. All of us have these problems. From the moment we're born, every human being has to go through this again. And the thing that I think upsets most people is the randomness of being chosen, the randomness of being loved better than somebody else. Is there anybody out there who doesn't feel that their mother approves of what they're doing in life? Is there anybody out there who feels that their fathers don't approve of what they've decided to do in their lives? Does anybody know the depth of pain in families where one child feels, and we're back to Florence, we're back to Cain and Abel right now. What does it say in the story of Cain and Abel? Vayisha Adonai el Hevel v'el minchato, v'el Cain v'el minchato lo sha'a. God favored Abel and his sacrifice. But as for Cain and his sacrifice, God didn't favor. Now, some of you must have watched that marvelous rendition of John Steinbeck's East of Eden during the summer on television. It was a remake of the original James Dean. It was absolutely exquisite, the way it brought out the Cain and Abel story. This young man who killed himself making money in order to pay his father for all that he had lost on that crazy business venture of trying to sell lettuces, frozen lettuces, the whole thing melts. And the father wasn't interested in him for reasons we will never know. I suspect now, I was thinking about this in connection with this study session this morning, that somehow that son reminded him of the whore mother, that somehow he wanted to shut him out of his mind because it reminded him of the intense love-hate relationship he had with this woman who left him and went to a brothel after the children were born. And the other one, the goody-goody one, the one who didn't want to know about evil, the one who pretended to be so beautiful and innocent and virgin-like, that was the one whom he loved. This terrible feeling that no matter what you do, your father will not accept you, no matter what you do. There's no way you can buy him a present that he's going to like. It's a proverbial story of the Jewish boy who bought whose mother bought him 2 ties, and he wears one the next morning, and she says, the other one you don't like. You can't win with this kind of mother. There's a poignant book that just was published. It's reviewed on page 16 of the New York Times this morning. It's called Intensive Care. It's about a family into whom is born a child with muscular dystrophy. The child is going to die. And the kind of questions that the parents have to deal with are, should we cut the tendons in his legs now and have him walk on crutches, or should we wait until his legs become distorted and he'll have to have his legs cut off? That kind of question. Husband and wife deciding to raise this child. The marriage gets a terrible battery. Anybody who's ever had a child in any kind of problem, whether sickness or accident or genetic or whatever, or mental, knows what we're talking about here. The marriage gets a battering. And one line, Anatole Broyard very often just hits the jackpot in a limpid sentence. He says, the problem of how the husband and wife have to try to learn to forgive one another for nature's cruelty. That's what we're talking about. Nature's cruelty. One of them thinks that the other one isn't working hard enough. The other one slept in too long, or the other one didn't go to the park today, or the other one didn't put something in the dishwasher, or the other one didn't clean up behind, or the room should have been vacuum cleaned, or something was missed, or whatever. The cruelty, and of course the whole thing is random. They didn't do anything about having the muscular dystrophy child. But the fact that they are presented with this stark reality forces them to be unkind to each other because they're trying to protect themselves against the cruelty of nature. It is almost as if we live in a cosmos in which God randomly decides that some people should live and some people should die. Glenn Gould should die at the age of 50. In the New York Times today, somebody else dies at 54. When you get to that age, you begin to get very queasy at breakfast reading the obituary notices in the New York Times. Whereas once you used to open at sports, now you open at the obituary notices, and you scan to see, well, when the 80-year-olds and 90-year-olds die, that's okay, but when it gets to be in the lower brackets, it's a bit scary. 20-year-olds, don't worry about this. 30, 40-year-olds start worrying, start sweating. That's when I'm very happy to see so many people in synagogue this morning. I thought you'd be out, all of you out there running for your lives in the marathon. It's tomorrow? Well, at least preparing for it. God, I'm sorry. Could you stand? I think we'll hear better.
Keep on going about God remembering Noah. Does that necessarily mean that he does not remember other people? That he does not remember the world? And is it also possible that Noah is symbolic not just for Noah and his family, but for a group of people? Now, here a minute. I just want to go on. You said about the Arabs in West Beirut. In 1945, did any of us care about any German? Is it possible that there is a time in history when we only care about us and there is no room for anyone else?
Yes. The answer to your question is yes. That is what this is all about this morning. The answer is that in some incredible way, our ancestors, through this story, tell us that one of the central problems in human life, which recurs in every generation, because this notion about God is in no way a description of a God who actually existed in any shape, size, or form. This God is a creation of the human psyche. This incredibly selfish, aggressive, megalomaniacal, narcissistic, borderline, low impulse control God is a creation of the human beings. And these things are the things which every child has to live through and reenact. That's why Grimm's fairy stories, unexpurgated, are such a delight to children. The very notion of the flood with all the mud and all the chazarai and the filth and the wet is one marvelous anal dream. That's where it comes from, the mud and the water and the wetness and everybody being drowned and choked. Yes, it's one massive childhood fantasy about what happens in the world's toilet. When God doesn't want them anymore, he pulls the chain and flushes them all away. Yes, Maren?
I see it differently.
So what else is new, Maren?
See, I wasn't as offended as you by that verse. Previous verses are much more offensive. But it suddenly dawned on me, of course, that this echoes to me in the second chapter of Exodus, which is, if I remember correctly, the only other place the word ark is used in the whole Bible, is the one in which Moses is put. And that ark is also described about how it's made with swine and pitch, in the same way that the ark for Noah is made with pitch. No other description exists anywhere else that I can pull in the Bible on how to make an ark. And in both places, people are chosen. In the same sense that Moses is in the middle of a holocaust of babies, in which babies are to be thrown into the Nile and killed on the order of the Pharaoh, the god king drowned by the god king of the Pharaoh of Egypt. The God of the Hebrews has also done the same thing here. I think, of course, there's a clear echo here. I think there's something else being said, because after he is drawn forth, Moses is drawn forth, comes the point at which in the Exodus story, and God remembers the groaning and the moaning of the Hebrew children, and sets Moses to become the Savior. It's afterwards, I just checked, it's not in the first two chapters that God remembers the Hebrews groaning. It's only after that Moses is pulled forth out of the Nile River in the ark. And I think there's a tremendous echo there. And I think that that echo is about, and which goes on further later on as a part of this, is that no matter how far we fall down, God will somehow, I mean, it's not my belief, this is what I think is being said, God will somehow appoint someone to lead us forth and to become a leader. There will be a Mashiach, and that Mashiach appears in a number of different places. I tell you, it only occurred to me because I was sitting here listening.
Well, Myron, you have greatly enriched us. I never realized that before. It is obvious now that there is an incredible paradigmatic equivalence between the ark in which Moses, the baby, is placed in the water, and the ark in which Moses, the savior of the Jewish people, and Noah, who is the father of the savior of the Jewish people, namely Abraham, after 10 generations. There's no question in my mind. Here we have another beautiful example of what we're talking about. There is an incredible symmetry in the Bible. I cannot urge the congregation too strongly and our visitors to read a book which was published recently by Northrop Frye called The Great Code. I believe I've already mentioned it several times from the pulpit, but since we have visitors today, I'm mentioning it again. This book entirely deals with the issue of the way in which the Bible consists of repeating paradigms, cyclical paradigms, of this, precisely of this order. The whole notion is there. The question that I want to focus on, however, is the fact that the emotions which led to the making of the story of Noah and the flood are not emotions which existed 3,000 years ago alone. They are alive and kicking with us today. Every baby that is born into the world has to go through all these feelings and these experiences. And perhaps the most difficult experience to work out from is the feeling that one is chosen. In 1915, Sigmund Freud wrote an article, a brief article, about what he called the exception, a special type that he'd come across in his work with neurotics. A person who feels that because he was born with certain handicap, a club foot, for example, the classical example of this is Richard III. Because I have a hunchback, because I am a cripple, because I am ugly, therefore I have paid the bill. Therefore, nature owes me a livelihood. I don't have to obey the ordinary run-of-the-mill moral laws. That's for the masses. I can do what I like because I suffered. I've paid my entrance fee into this world. But in 5 years, in a much larger paper, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud developed this, extrapolated this, not just to the people, to a handful of people like Richard III, but to every single human being that's born. All of us want certain things which we can't have. All of us feel that we've been done out of something. All of us feel that we've been cheated merely by being human, and therefore we are going to get it back. We paid our dues. And of course we have paid much more than the guy next door, and therefore we need more, we should have more, and we are going to get more. That impulse, that drive in every single human being is the rock-bottom foundation of the notion that the Jews are the chosen people. Because we arrived in the Middle East when everybody else had taken up the real estate, and because we had to wander in the wilderness, and because we were persecuted by the Egyptians, and because we starved in the wilderness, and because we didn't have any food and protection, now we've got a land of our own, we can kill everybody else because it's our right. We've suffered. The Holocaust, people killed us, therefore we can take what we want. We have a right to everything, and nobody else has a right to tell us no, because we are special, we are exceptional. This is not an ancient theme. This is a very modern theme. And the problem is that if we read the Bible as a literal story about God, we miss the point completely. The Bible doesn't tell us about God. As Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of this institution, constantly reminds us, the Bible nowhere tells us about God. The Bible tells us what our ancestors believed about God, which is a whole different ballgame. It's a whole different kettle of fish. And they were more primitive than we are. There is, however, as our good friend at the back, whom I don't know, a visitor I think, I hope it's a visitor, not a new member of the congregation, where people are joining so rapidly that I never know who's who these days. Who are you anyway? Good. A visitor who I hope will become a member after this morning. You can't say no, after all said no. What happens when a parent favors one child over another? What happens when a child feels that one parent favors a child over another? You see, very often the Oedipus complex is misunderstood. People talk about the child wanting to kill the father. But actually, in Jewish tradition, we look at it from a different point of view. We talk about the father who wants to kill the child. The Akedah story is about the father wanting to kill the child. Why does the father want to kill the child? Because the father was once a child and remembers what he used to feel about his father, and he wants to get rid of the son before he's old enough to think about doing to him what he wanted to do to his father. Do you follow my tortuous logic? In other words, we are now at the bottom, the rock bottom of where we start from. Human beings feel that there isn't enough to go around. There isn't enough milk. There isn't enough food. There isn't enough love. And therefore corner the market on it. If you edge somebody else out, so what? Esau and Jacob might be seen as yet another paradigm of what we are talking about here. There the mother and the father gets into the act in terms of favoritism. It is not possible ever to exorcise from ourselves the emotions which gave rise to the story of Noah and the flood. It is not possible for human beings ever to completely exorcise from their minds those base instincts which gave rise to the notion that human beings could create a God who would destroy the entire world just to save one people, which I hope we moderns find ethically offensive and reprehensible. We never totally exorcise that. What we have to do with that is get in touch with it and reject it. There's no harm. There's no harm in loving one child more than another inside yourself, but you must never show it on the surface. It's only natural sometimes if one child is picking up the father's unconscious messages and reenacting in the child's life the thing that the father wanted, or the mother, the daughter becomes what the mother wanted to become, or the daughter lives out some of the mother's fantasies. There's no harm in thinking that. But the children have to feel that they are loved equally. And by the same token, the children must realize that when they feel that one child or one sibling is being looked at with more love and affection and attention than the other, to exaggerate is to overlook all those other occasions when the opposite is the case. Siblings have a wonderful knack of only noticing how much A is being loved today without noticing that it was B and C and D and E and F the week before. The emotions of the Bible have lasted this long precisely because they aren't dead. They are with us today. And I'm not going to insult all of you by drawing too many underlinings of what is happening in the world today. I'll just give one example. In the story of the flood, as the young lady at the back mentioned, in order to tolerate the idea that God only loved the Jewish people and that he rejected all the rest of the world, how was the biblical author to account for this fantasy, this illusion? What was the only way in which the biblical author could justify that God loved the Jewish people only? How could that be justified? There's only one way in which it could be justified. By making out that everybody else in the world was thoroughly and totally wicked. In other words, if you want to indulge in the notion that all the Japanese are bad, and all the Germans are bad, and all the Arabs are members of the PLO, and therefore all Arabs are bad, and all of these people therefore have to be destroyed, you're back to square one. This is where the human race started from. Whereas in fact the Bible is a dialectic which says, yes, these emotions are there, but we have to work on them. There is a dialectic between the story of Noah and the flood, which we can never get rid of, and the story of Jonah. A tension between these two. The very story of Noah, as we've seen proof positive this morning, as you yourselves have shown, elicits an overtone of the coming response, an ethical response, where Jonah brings the message of God's mercy and compassion to an entire city of Gentiles. Nineveh could be Berlin. Nineveh could be Beirut. Nineveh could be Dresden. Nineveh could be Nagasaki, Hiroshima. There are two attitudes. Either we say, destroy them all. Right now we're under such pressure, we have no time to think of anybody. Just wipe them all out. We have to survive. Of course that's something that, it's always there. But wrestling with it is the notion of God's love. I have one final point to make, and it comes from Rashi. It says, Rashi says, Vayizkor Elohim et Noach. God remembered Noah. Rashi draws attention to a very interesting phenomenon. That, again, it's what I would say, Rashi is trying to save the Bible's face. As a matter of fact, if I were to sum up rabbinic literature, rabbinic Judaism, I would say that rabbinic Judaism, I'm talking about the Midrash, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the whole thing. If I were to be asked to sum up in one sentence what the purpose of rabbinic literature is, it's to make the God of the Bible look good. He is an embarrassment to us. If he came back today, he'd probably end up in Bellevue. It is the Jewish people who make a new man of him. But what really is going on is not that we're making a new man of God, we're making a new people of ourselves. The different shifting God ideas, the evolving God ideas, are an external expression and articulation of the way in which the Jewish people deals with its own ethical growth. Now, what we've seen recently is some Jews can go right back to the beginning, 3,000 years ago, to the story of Noah, under pressure. But also that other Jews are on the side of Jonah, and they say, you can't do that. You can't say they're all rotten. You can't write them all off. In the desire to make the Jewish people survive, you can't say, après nous le déluge. Let everybody else get wiped out. I'm all right, Jack, the rest of you can go to hell. One hears, fortunately, only in small pockets of Jewish life today. I hope it's small pockets. Maybe West 86th Street is a rarefied street. But the dialectic and the tension is still there. Each one of us as Jews has a long history of ethical tension. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our ancestors, above all, we owe it to our children and grandchildren that we enter the battle. We do not let the battle be lost by default. We enter the battle not by coming out with ad hoc ethical slogans which are totally cut off from our Jewish past, but we make our ethical statements within the context of Jewish tradition. We are not ashamed that our ancestors had these feelings. After all, it was 3,000 years ago. I can make an allowance for something that happened 3,000 years ago. I am much less liable to make an allowance for something that happened 3 weeks ago. We can make allowance for those feelings and instincts then. We can make allowances for our own instincts now. We dare not allow ourselves to repeat the story of Noah and the flood. We should have learned something.